3 weeks after a luxury golf developer cut down 4 oak trees on my property, their brand new signature tee box was sitting empty behind a county closure order. Investors were demanding answers, and the executive who told me the project would benefit everyone was standing on my porch asking what it would take to make the problem disappear. The crazy part is that none of it started with a lawsuit, a screaming match, or some long-running feud. It started because a group of people looked at trees they didn't own and decided those trees were in the way of making more money. I live outside a small town called Willow Creek, Tennessee, in a house I've owned for nearly a decade. It's the kind of place that would never end up in a luxury real estate magazine, but that's exactly why I love it. The backyard backs up against a private golf course, and whenever people visited, they assumed that was the selling point. It wasn't. The real reason I bought the property was a row of giant oak trees stretching across the rear boundary. Those trees gave me privacy, shade, and something that's getting harder to find these days: peace. Every evening after work, I'd sit on my deck with a drink and watch the sunlight move through the branches. Sometimes I'd see deer wander through the wooded area beyond the course. Sometimes I'd just sit there and enjoy the quiet. The trees created a natural wall between my life and the rest of the world. Maybe that sounds sentimental, but homeowners understand. Some things become part of your daily routine for so many years that you stop noticing how much they matter until they're gone. For years, the golf course was owned by a local family. We barely interacted. They maintained their property, I maintained mine, and life was simple. Then everything changed when a development company called Stonebridge Ventures purchased the course and several hundred surrounding acres. Within months, construction crews appeared everywhere. The old clubhouse was renovated. New landscaping went in. Expensive marketing signs started advertising luxury golf estates and premium community living. Suddenly, there were architects, engineers, surveyors, and consultants driving around in shiny SUVs. The whole place felt different. One afternoon, I was repairing a loose section of fencing when a black SUV pulled into my driveway. A man stepped out wearing a pressed polo shirt and a smile that looked professionally manufactured. He introduced himself as Derek Holloway, the project's development director. We shook hands, exchanged small talk, and within 5 minutes he got to the reason he'd come. He wanted to discuss the new championship tee box being built behind my property. According to Derek, it would become one of the most attractive locations on the entire course. Golfers would have incredible views, future homebuyers would love it, and the project would add prestige to the community. I listened politely until he glanced toward my tree line. That's when I knew where the conversation was headed. The only challenge, he said carefully, is that those trees limit visibility from the new tee area. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Those trees are on my property, I said. Of course, he replied. We understand that. Then I guess we don't have a problem. For a brief moment his smile tightened. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for me. Then he recovered and started talking about mutually beneficial solutions. I hate phrases like that. In my experience, mutually beneficial usually means one side gets what they want while the other side gets an explanation. I shook my head. The trees stay. Derek nodded, thanked me for my time, and drove away. The conversation lasted less than 15 minutes, but something about it bothered me afterward. Maybe it was the confidence in his voice. Maybe it was the feeling that he hadn't really accepted my answer. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake it. Over the next couple of weeks, construction intensified around the golf course. Equipment moved constantly. Contractors worked near the rear fairway. Every now and then I'd catch myself looking toward the oak trees without even realizing it. Then came the weekend, everything went sideways. My sister was moving into a new home a few hours away and needed help. I left Friday morning and returned late Sunday evening, exhausted from carrying furniture and pretending my back still worked like it did 20 years ago. I unloaded my truck, took a shower, and went to bed. The next morning I walked into the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and glanced through the back window. Something immediately felt wrong. At first I couldn't identify it. The yard looked brighter, wider, exposed somehow. Then my brain caught up with my eyes. The shade was gone. I set the coffee down and walked outside. The moment I stepped onto the deck, my stomach dropped. 4 of my largest oak trees had been cut down. Not damaged, not trimmed, completely removed. Fresh stumps sat near the rear boundary, surrounded by piles of sawdust. Through the opening I could see straight across the golf course. And sitting beyond the gap was the new tee box, perfectly positioned to enjoy the view my trees had been blocking. For several seconds I just stood there. The scene didn't feel real. Those trees had been there longer than I'd owned the property. They'd survived storms, droughts, and years of changing seasons. Now they were gone because someone had decided they were inconvenient. Then the shock gave way to anger. Real anger. The kind that settles into your chest and makes everything suddenly very clear. I got in my truck and headed directly for the golf course maintenance yard because at that moment I wanted answers, and deep down I already suspected exactly where those answers were going to lead. The maintenance yard sat behind a row of equipment sheds near the far end of the course. And by the time I pulled in, my coffee was cold and my patience was gone. A few workers were loading chainsaws and trimming equipment onto a trailer when I walked straight toward them and asked the question that had been bouncing around in my head since I stepped into my backyard. Who cut down the trees behind my property? The men exchanged quick looks. One of them finally said, "We did." He said it casually, like he was talking about mowing grass. I pointed toward the golf course. Those trees were on my land. The worker's expression changed immediately. Another guy looked away. A third shifted uncomfortably before saying, "We were told they were part of the boundary cleanup." By who? I asked. Nobody answered at first. Then someone muttered, "Management approved the work order." I didn't push the workers any further because it was obvious they weren't the people making decisions. They were just following instructions. The real question was who had given those instructions and why they thought they could get away with it. I went home and spent the rest of the evening digging through every property document I owned. Surveys, deeds, closing paperwork, inspection reports, everything. By midnight, my dining room table looked like a legal archive. The more I reviewed the documents, the more certain I became. There was no confusion about the property line. None. The trees had been well inside my boundary. Whoever authorized the removal either never checked the survey or didn't care what it said. The next morning, I called a local surveyor named Harold Mercer. Harold had spent nearly 30 years mapping properties throughout the county. If anyone could settle the matter beyond argument, it was him. 2 days later, he arrived with his crew. They spent hours measuring distances, checking historical records, locating markers, and comparing everything against the county maps. I followed the process from my deck, trying not to look impatient. Finally, Harold walked over carrying a clipboard. "Tell me something good," I said. He laughed. "Depends who's asking." Then he pointed toward the stumps. "Every one of those trees was clearly inside your property." "How clearly?" I asked. "Clear enough that nobody should have touched them." That was all I needed to hear. Harold's crew installed bright survey markers along the boundary, and the results made the situation impossible to deny. The stump sat several feet inside my land. Not inches, not fractions, several feet. Most people would have called a lawyer immediately. I considered it. In fact, I even spoke with one. But before taking that route, I wanted to understand the bigger picture. Something about the entire situation felt rushed. Developers don't usually risk legal trouble over a handful of trees unless those trees are standing in the way of something valuable. So I started researching the project itself. Every evening after work, I dug through county records, permit applications, planning documents, environmental reports, public meeting notes. The deeper I looked, the more ambitious the development appeared. Stonebridge Ventures wasn't simply renovating a golf course. They were building an upscale community around it. Future home sales depended on premium amenities. Marketing materials emphasized scenic views. Investors expected deadlines to be met. Suddenly, those trees looked less like landscaping and more like an obstacle standing between the company and a profitable sales pitch. Then one night, I found something that changed everything. Buried deep inside a permit package for the new championship tee box was a section discussing residential impact mitigation. Most people would have skipped right over it. I almost did. Then one sentence caught my attention. The county approval referenced the existing mature tree buffer separating the course from neighboring residential properties. I reread the sentence 3 times. Then I opened the supporting documents. The more I read, the harder I smiled. The tree line wasn't just decoration. It was part of the approved plan. The county considered it an important visual and safety barrier between the golf course and nearby homes. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. If I was reading the documents correctly, the company had just removed a feature that helped justify the permit approval. In other words, This wasn't only about my property anymore. It was potentially a permit compliance issue. The next morning, I contacted the county planning office. The woman who answered sounded politely skeptical at first. I'm sure she hears complaints every day. But once I explained the survey results and referenced the permit conditions, her tone changed. Do you have supporting documentation? She asked. I looked at the growing stack of papers on my desk. More than enough. Over the next several days, I submitted everything. Survey reports, property records, photographs of the stumps, historical images showing the original tree line, copies of the permit documents. I wasn't making accusations. I was simply providing information and asking the county to review it. Then I waited. Waiting turned out to be the most frustrating part of the entire process. Construction continued around the golf course. Trucks came and went. Landscaping crews worked near the fairway. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Meanwhile, I knew county officials were reviewing documents behind the scenes. About 10 days later, 2 county vehicles arrived. I happened to be home when they pulled up near the rear boundary. I'll admit something. I grabbed a lawn chair, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and watched the inspection from my deck. If you've ever witnessed somebody else's bad decision beginning to unravel, you'll understand why that tea tasted particularly good. The inspectors spent hours measuring distances and comparing markers to the survey reports. They photographed every stump from multiple angles. They reviewed maps and checked permit documentation. Then they walked toward the new tee box. That's where things became interesting. One inspector asked me to stand near my patio. Another stood on the tee box and looked toward my property. The missing trees had created a completely open path between the tee area and my backyard. For years, the oaks had served as a natural shield. Without them, golf balls could travel directly toward residential property. Even from a distance, I could see the inspectors discussing it. They took additional photographs and started making more notes. At that moment, I realized the company had accidentally created a second problem. The first problem was destroying trees on private property. The second problem was removing a safety barrier that helped protect nearby homeowners. Government agencies tend to take those issues seriously. A week later, the county made its decision. The new championship tee box received a stop-use order pending corrective action and compliance review. In plain English, it was closed. Completely closed. Golfers couldn't use it. The company couldn't advertise it. The expensive new feature sitting behind my property instantly became a very costly piece of unused real estate. News spread quickly throughout town. Golfers started asking questions. Neighbors discussed it over coffee. Rumors moved faster than facts, as they always do. Some people thought I was being stubborn. Others thought the developers got exactly what they deserved. I mostly stayed quiet. I knew the story wasn't finished yet. 3 days after the stop-use order was issued, a familiar black SUV rolled into my driveway. Derek Holloway stepped out looking very different from the confident executive who had visited weeks earlier. The polished smile was gone. So was the certainty. He walked up to my deck and stopped beside the patio table. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Sure," I replied. We sat facing the backyard where the stumps remained like silent witnesses. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, Derek cleared his throat. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." I almost laughed. For mature oak trees don't disappear because of a misunderstanding. They disappear because someone makes a decision. But I let him continue. He talked about communication errors, contractor confusion, unfortunate circumstances. Interestingly, he never actually apologized. Then he opened a folder and spread several landscaping proposals across the table. Small replacement trees, decorative shrubs, fresh mulch, the cheapest solution imaginable wrapped in professional presentation graphics. I studied the drawings before looking up. "These trees are 8 feet tall. They'll grow," he said. "Eventually," I replied. His expression tightened. The conversation became noticeably colder after that, because for the first time he seemed to realize I wasn't interested in helping him minimize the damage. I wanted the damage repaired. The county required a functional tree buffer. The original oaks provided one. Tiny replacement trees wouldn't satisfy that purpose for decades. Deep down, both of us knew it. Several minutes passed in tense silence before Derek finally leaned back in his chair and asked the question he'd been avoiding since he arrived. "Okay," he said quietly. "What exactly do you want?" I looked at him, then at the stumps behind him, and finally at the closed tee box sitting in the distance. The truth was, I'd already figured out my answer days earlier, and when I finally gave it to him, I watched the confidence disappear from his face almost immediately because he realized the situation was about to become far more expensive than he ever imagined. I looked at Derek for a moment before answering because the truth was, this stopped being about compensation the second those trees hit the ground. Money mattered, sure, but what bothered me most was the assumption behind the decision. Somebody had looked at my property, decided their project was more important than my rights, and acted accordingly. That kind of thinking has a way of irritating me. You really want to know what I want? I asked. Derek nodded. I reached into a folder I'd prepared earlier and slid a document across the table. He picked it up, scanned the first page, then flipped to the estimate. His eyebrows immediately went up. The proposal came from a company that specialized in mature tree relocation. Not saplings. Not decorative landscaping. Mature oak trees large enough to restore the buffer as quickly as possible. The estimate included transportation, specialized equipment, reinforced root systems, installation, maintenance, and monitoring. The price wasn't small. In fact, it was dramatically larger than the landscaping package he'd offered. Derek looked up. You're serious? Completely. He stared at the paperwork for several seconds. This is expensive. I shrugged. So was cutting down somebody else's trees. The silence that followed was probably my favorite moment of the entire conversation. Then I handed him another document. This one came from the county zoning office. Derek read the first page, then the second, and his expression somehow got worse. What's this? He asked. My alternative solution. Because the tree buffer was gone and golf balls could now travel directly toward my property, I had the right to install a protective structure along the rear boundary. A very tall one, potentially 20 feet high, entirely legal, entirely on my property. Derek slowly lowered the paper and looked toward the golf course. Even from my deck, you could see the problem. The premium tee box depended on the view. A giant protective barrier would destroy that view overnight. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. They removed my trees to improve visibility, and now the replacement could be a wall much taller and much uglier than anything they had cut down. Derek leaned back and rubbed his forehead. For the first time since we'd met, he looked genuinely tired. I need to discuss this with the company, he said. Take all the time you need, I replied. The county already closed the tee box. He gave a short nod and left. 3 days later he came back. This time, he wasn't carrying landscaping sketches. He arrived with company attorneys and a signed proposal. Stonebridge Ventures agreed to fund the mature tree installation. They agreed to cover restoration costs. They agreed to comply with county requirements and implement additional protective measures if necessary. Most importantly, they agreed to do it according to specifications approved by county officials. In other words, they agreed to fix the problem properly. I reviewed the documents carefully before signing. As we finished, I looked at Derek and asked, "So we're done calling this a misunderstanding?" He actually laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who knew an expensive lesson had just been learned. A few weeks later, enormous trucks rolled into the neighborhood carrying replacement oak trees. Neighbors came outside to watch because the entire operation looked more like a commercial construction project than residential landscaping. Crews spent days positioning the trees, securing the roots, and restoring the buffer zone. When everything was finished, the backyard finally started to feel like itself again. Not perfect. You can't replace decades of growth overnight. But it was close enough that I could sit on my deck and enjoy my privacy again. Eventually, the county approved the corrective work and lifted the stop-use order. The tee box reopened. Golfers returned. The development moved forward. Life settled down. But every time I look toward that section of the course, I think about how unnecessary the entire situation was. One respectful conversation could have prevented months of headaches, thousands of dollars in costs, and a public embarrassment that spread throughout the county. Instead, somebody chose the shortcut. And shortcuts have a funny habit of becoming detours. In the end, I got my trees back, the county got compliance, and the developers got a very expensive reminder that property lines aren't suggestions. They're boundaries. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have accepted a simple cash settlement and moved on, or would you have pushed for full restoration like I did? Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors, developers, HOAs, or anyone else who thought they could ignore your rights because they had more money or influence, share your story too. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.